All right. Like I said, my name is April Wagner, and I am a member of the BTIS initiative and host for your event. I am the Employment Support Coordinator at Fairfield County Board of Developmental Disabilities. Trauma-informed care practices have been increasingly used in a variety of areas, including social services, education, behavioral health, and legal systems, to address the needs of individuals who have experienced traumatic life events. This virtual conference is intended to increase our community's capacity to develop a broad approach toward addressing trauma-based practices with a shared understanding of trauma and its impact through a collective response that supports resilience and healing. The BTIS initiative in Fairfield County is comprised of a multitude of community partners. This virtual conference would not have been possible without their dedication in organizing and presenting the content, providing credits, and facilitating the event. This training is being recorded. The training may be available for public view. We will be hosting the training on a speaker view, and the chat box will be monitored throughout the training. Please enter all questions or comments into the chat box. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to the evaluation survey for the training and a copy of the PowerPoint. I'll also put it in the chat for you. This evaluation must be returned to receive your CEU certificate. All participants will receive a certificate of attendance. Please also indicate your attendance today by entering your first and last name in the chat box by the end of the session. Thank you to all the BTIS members on the platform today, and thank you for attending this training. And now I would like to take a moment to introduce our speaker. Jennifer Beckley-Watson is a licensed professional clinical counselor and has been independently licensed since 1998. Jennifer earned her master's degree from Ohio University through the College of Education and Community Counseling. As a clinician, Jennifer has worked with children and families in a variety of settings, including home, school, and community. Prior to coming to Fairfield County, she worked 6 years in Hocking County as an intensive home-based counselor and part of the school prevention program. Jennifer has worked for New Horizons for the past 18 years and currently carries a small counseling caseload of younger youth and their families needing outpatient counseling services. During her time at New Horizons, she has had the opportunity to work closely with a variety of programs in the community, including early childhood, where she worked with Head Start, Early Head Start, local preschools, child care centers to provide training, consulting, and counseling services as an early childhood mental health consultant. She has also done school-based services, including family counseling with youth and families and child protective services, and provided clinical supervision to counselors working with children in outpatient and community-based settings. Jennifer currently works full-time at Fairfield County Juvenile Court as the behavioral health lead, where she has been for the past 5 years, working with youth and families, as well as consulting with court staff on ongoing programming and services. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer.
Thank you, April. Um, Thank you all for being here today. I'm excited, I'm a little nervous about the presentation. This is my first virtual, so we'll see how it goes. And talking with Keith approached me about doing a training on family engagement. And I was like, sure. I had lots of different ideas. And I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about that. I've done some research and going through some trainings. And it was really hard to kind of get the conceptualization on where do we start with family engagement? Like, what are our challenges and how do we approach it? And everything I read and have researched goes back to looking at the trauma informed concepts that we already know, but applying it more to the families and the caregivers. So today isn't going to be a lot of new information, but really looking through that trauma lens on what we think about and how we intervene with the parents and caregivers of children. And that's kind of with that focus of trauma led to the title of Heal Yourself to Heal Your Kids, because we have to recognize that the parents and caregivers that we're working with have experienced trauma, and we know the importance of working with trauma and that importance of healing. So that's what led to the title today. So we want to look at how parents and caregivers, the importance of them healing themselves so that they're able to support their kids in their healing process from those who've experienced trauma. So one of the things I think that we've done is we've shifted to understand trauma and looking from a child's behavior very differently. It's not changing the behaviors of the kids that we work with, but we have a better understanding of what is the cause of the behavior. And by understanding that behavior better, then we're more able to intervene and have more appropriate planning with that child. So I know that comes a little bit more naturally, and we've worked really hard on doing that with individuals and children, but I'm not sure that we always do that with the parents and caregivers and their behavior. Um, so if I'm not looking at the parents and caregivers' behavior through that trauma lens, then I can misunderstand their behavior, which means my approach or my intervention with that parent or caregiver is not going to be the most helpful because I'm not really understanding what's happening. So we already know that the youth that we work with, by far, there's more youth that we work with in systems and in the community that have been impacted with trauma. With trauma, so we need to recognize again that the families whom they live with have also been impacted by trauma, whether it's secondary or trauma from their own background. In addition to talking about caregivers and the importance of caregivers healing themselves and how we support them on that, we're also going to be looking at ourselves as providers and how we're caring and healing ourselves. We all have lives outside of our jobs, but we are also impacted by those that we work with as we are present and empathetically listening to our kids and our families talk about their traumatic experience. It does have an impact. And so we also want to be aware of how we're healing ourselves and being aware um, of our reactions to take care of ourselves because we need to be healthy in order to support the kids and families that we work with. So we all know that it's very challenging to be working with kids. For every child that we work with, we know they come with a parent, a caregiver, and other families. So we always know there's more than one person that we're working with. Um, so we know that when we're working with children, that we have to be able to recognize and understand that children really have little to no capacity to be more regulated than the environment for the adults are in charge of their world, and that we can't expect kids to make changes without the parents and caregivers being a part of that healing process. And in order for that to happen, we have to work with parents on how to help them regulate themselves because we're going to be expecting them to regulate their kids. So, again, today isn't really new information, and we could spend days talking about what we know about trauma. But I'm just going to highlight a few of the facts that I think are important that we're going to reference in talking today about family engagement. Um, so, we'll start with the definition of what trauma is. According to SAMHSA, individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life threatening and has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well being. So, how an individual experiences that trauma, not just the event, determines if there's a trauma, if it's trauma by that person, how they define it. We also know that the statistics for kids and adults in our different settings are pretty high. So, in working the juvenile justice system, upwards of 94% of children in the juvenile justice settings have experienced trauma. 84% of adult mental health clients have also experienced trauma histories. So we know that it's prevalent. And again, when we know it's prevalent with the kids, then the parents and caregivers, we know is the same likelihood. So it's not about which one in our office. There's more who come in with that trauma experience than those that are not coming in. So we also know that research shows that human beings respond to stress and trauma in very similar ways all across the globe. It's not unique to our country or to our culture. And as we identified in that definition, the definition that we know the significant impact that trauma has on us individually, it affects all aspects of our life: physical, mental, social, genetically, behaviorally, which then can interfere with daily functioning and our relationships. We also understand what occurs in the brain and the body as a result of trauma. And there's very clear biological reactions. And these are automatic responses. Again, this is not unique to just us here locally. This is for everybody across the world. So there is that very clear biologic response. So the trauma resiliency model was developed by Elaine Miller Harris, and she has a really good job kind of breaking down some of that biology, just to kind of understand what we're going to talk about today. So one of the things that we know is the impact of the brain on how it works with trauma. And so if you divide the brain into two parts, the cortex part or the thinking brain is what is in charge of thinking, organizing behavior, making choices of what's right or wrong, kind of how we reason through. The other part of the brain is the limbic area, or the emotional brain, where the amygdala is. This is the part that automatically evaluates what is safe and what is not. It's hardwired to remember anything that has threatened us, so as to sound an alarm if it perceives danger. So after stressful or traumatic events, that it can be too active and continue to sound that alarm even when there is no danger. So the emotional brain or limbic area takes that information from the body's senses and decides on actions. So in the limbic part, the emotional brain is triggered with the survival response. That means other parts of the brain, such as the cortex or thinking brain, is not activated. So we don't have access to the logic, to the language, to the moral reasoning. So even if we have built up skills to manage, to cope with stressors, we don't always have access to it when the limbic or emotional part of the brain is activated. We also know that human beings have the capacity to use their internal and external resources or coping skills to help them through their lives. And this is what resiliency is. We know that growth and change require an intentional and sustained ability to stay in the resiliency zone. Self regulation is a starting point once safety is established. So it looks like there's a lot going on in this slide, but this slide for me is a good visualization to kind of understand what's kind of happening when we look at people who are maybe activated or stuck in the high zone or stuck in that low zone. So I'm not sure if you guys have seen this, but it really is a great resource and conceptualization. I've used it a lot even with the kids and families that I work with to kind of, again, provide that visualization to understand what is happening because we know that these are automatic things that are happening. So if we look at this slide, in between the blue dotted lines is a resiliency zone. And this is what our goal is. When we're in the resiliency zone, that's where we can think clearly, we can handle feelings better, we can manage the sensations inside of our bodies. This is where we have the best capacity for flexibility and adaptability. As you can see with the black line, there's some normal up and downs, but then we're able to make adjustments within ourselves or to balance to stay within that resilient zone. That's where we're using our resources, our coping strategies to stay balanced and within the resilient zone. When traumatic or stressful events occur, that natural rhythm within the nervous system may be thrown out of balance. And then when bumped out of its natural rhythm, the capacity to handle even everyday life events are difficult. And you can see by looking at the red line, that's getting bumped out of that resiliency zone. And then we can get stuck, whether it be in that high or that low zone. And this results in different problems that they may have with family and work and within the community. So the triggers or reminders of past events may even push us out beyond that resiliency zone. And as we discussed about understanding the brain a little bit better, that when we're not in the resilient zone, then we're not able to access the skills as part of the thinking brain. So we don't have that logic. We're harder to process language when we're in that high or that low zone. So we're going to look at what some of those behaviors might look like when someone on an individual basis might be stuck in that high or that low zone. So in the high zone, you may observe someone yelling, angry outburst, anxiety, panic, mania, difficulty focusing, may have problems sleeping, um, tend to focus more on their self or irritable, sometimes not able to engage in planful responses, um, harder to reason through something. In the low zone, someone might appear depressed or sad or isolated, exhaustion, fatigue, or numbness. And as we think about what the individual's indicators might be for individual people, what those behaviors look like, think about yourselves. And we all have those times where we may get pushed out of our resiliency zone. And what would that look like? How do we know? How are we paying attention to ourselves and how we're regulating and how we make those adjustments? So, again, that's something we need to be focusing on because we need to keep ourselves in that resiliency zone as we're working with others who may not always be there. So as we apply this to caregivers, um, what are some of the behaviors we might see from caregivers or families if they are in either the high or that low zone? So in the high zone, there might be arguing, instability, lots of changes within not being able to think things through, There may be anger, anxiety. Decisions can be inconsistent and reactionary versus planned out. And I think we see this sometimes with parenting, and how parents can go through a parenting class and have all that knowledge. But then when it comes time and there's conflict, they're kind of going back to just reacting and not necessarily the plan that had been established for parenting and just responding out of that reaction. It's harder to keep the commitments, and any requests may seem unrealistic. So when you're approaching a caregiver or parent, it's important to kind of look at what those behaviors are saying and where are they at? Are they in the high zone? Not a good time to be talking about asking for something else. So if you look in the low zone, we may see as if the parent doesn't care or they're distracted from the conversation, maybe withdrawn. We might say that they're not attending appointments, maybe not following the plan, avoiding communication, or having very little communication. So teaching resiliency with individual children is something that happens a lot in counseling. I see it going on in schools and even those who are engaged in occupational therapy. That regulation is very important. We're working on that with kids. However, we also know that children don't have that capacity to be more regulated than their environment. And when the adults control the environment, it's really important for parents and caregivers to be able to regulate themselves, because if they're up in the high or the low zone, they're not going to be able to help their child regulate. And even if the child is doing all that they can, all the skills they've learned to stay in that resiliency zone, if the parents are not operating that same zone, the kids are going to get bumped out too. So this is where it's really important, for us to be focusing on supporting parents and caregivers and understanding this concept, and that them working on themselves to heal themselves, to understand how they need to stay in that resiliency zone is very important. And we also have to be aware of ourselves and how do we keep ourselves balanced in that resiliency zone so that we can regulate our own emotions. So going back to an earlier statement that growth and change required that intentional and sustained ability to stay in that resiliency zone. That's something we're going to be kind of referencing today on that importance of how we stay regulated, how we support parents to stay regulated to ensure that the kids are able to stay regulated. So it all kind of interrelates. So hopefully that all makes sense. And if there's any big questions, I'll trust April to let me know and interrupt if there's any big questions coming through on that. Um, so from understanding the zones of resiliency, it really helps us understand what the behaviors are telling us. Um, and it really has shifted how we look at what are problem behaviors. As a result, we've changed our questions. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, we're asking what has happened to you, and understand that these behaviors are survival strategies. It was a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And when we made this shift to understanding through trauma informed, we also recognize that we don't need to not to blame the individual for the behaviors, but to recognize that behavior as more of a survival reaction, and how this behavior was a coping skill and a resource for the circumstances. We stopped asking what are your symptoms and diagnosis, and instead, how have you coped or adapted?
Jennifer, we do have a question.
Okay,
Abby Witten asks, what are things I can tell parents and kiddos in my family session to do for quick regulation tips?
great. I think some of the easiest ones that I do, is really just kind of taking that deep breath. I think knowing yourself, and if there's times when you find yourself getting dysregulated, what do you do to calm yourself? So starting even just by modeling, like, "Ooh, it's been a busy day. Actually, that feels really good because I'm a little stressed and presenting today." And how do you take those times? Sometimes it can be a movement or a break. Um, just other strategies that just have that coping mechanism. I think movement, especially kind of that repetitive movement, really works with kids and families, kind of depending on what that age is. For older kids, even just throwing a ball back and forth, or having the parent throw the ball back and forth with the kid, or taking a walk together, something just to kind of break up that moment.
I know something I personally have found that has helped me is mindfulness. And I
Mhm.
practice that with my daughter. So it could be something as simple as, and I'm not a therapist, I just want to throw that out there, but something as simple as as you're sitting in a chair, feeling what the pressure feels like under your feet. And what are a few things that maybe you can see around you, or what are a few things that you can smell around you, just kind of focusing on the present moment and just being there and focusing on what is happening, at that second. So that's
Absolutely.
just my own personal.
And I don't think you have to be a therapist to teach mindfulness. I think it's something we all have those strategies that we use. And even with mindfulness, sometimes I do with kids kind of be aware of being in that moment, even like a tic tac or a piece of candy and focusing on what does that feel like? But again, a very good strategy. They're not earth shattering things when we just think about everyday stuff that we use to regulate ourselves.
Abby has a statement and then also another question, if you don't mind, Jennifer.
Not at all.
She says, sometimes kiddos are more self aware than parents. How do we help them become more aware that they aren't in the safe zone?
I think we're talking about parents not aware in the safe zone.
How do we help them become aware that they aren't in? Yes, she says
Okay.
parents. Yes.
Um, I I think it's the same way we teach anything new. If I see a parent who maybe not so regulated, or they're really struggling, it might just be me modeling or reflecting that back. Like, wow, it seems like it's been a really rough day. Let's just take a couple minutes and sit, or let's just sit on the swing outside and swing for a few minutes. And it's just kind of taking that time to stop and not push through and add to that. Um, but I think that's just kind of that awareness, and it starts slow, just like we do with kids. It's a very slow process. And some of it's just kind of giving them the opportunity and time to look within themselves and again reflect that back, I think is a starting point.
Abby also says that she uses the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method all the time. I'm not familiar with that. I'm not sure if you are, Jennifer, or if Abby would want to share that with us.
I think it's great to hear from Abby what
Okay,
okay,
great.
because I think there's some like five things you see, four things you hear, but I think there's also breathing techniques that fall underneath that. So not sure exactly what she's talking about.
She says 5 senses.
Yeah.
So probably 5 things you hear, 4 things, all the way down. So
Yeah.
thank
And
you,
you go through the
Abby.
different senses. Yeah.
Okay, great.
All right. Was that it? Okay. Um, so as we see the behaviors more as survival skills and resources, um, and we start then, it's a very natural transition in understanding these behaviors have meaning and that they're actually strengths. And so, and how those behaviors that were once called problems are actually helpful. So then it's a natural lead into understanding the strength based and again, shifting how we think about the behavior and starting with what is going well. So we know that growth and change require the intentional, sustained ability, which is where we kind of bringing that awareness to the caregivers and to the kids, um, helps them be more intentional with it because sometimes we are stuck in that automatic response and not paying attention to it. And we start by ourselves, like how we work with ourselves and how we're paying attention to what our body cues are. So if we're going with the family and we start to feel a little revved up or you feel a little anxious, that's a good time to kind of take that deep breath or say, you know what, let's focus on something else going on around us. So now we're going to look at applying some of these concepts to parents and caregivers. And the next slide, um, I started with what are some of the challenges that we see in working with families. And so I reached out to coworkers, through other agencies I work with. So this is a variety of people that I've gotten the information from, as well as kind of the frustrations and challenges I've had over the years in working with families. So this is not a comprehensive list. This is just kind of categories on what information that we got. And so we have parents not showing up for appointments, parents not following through with plans, not returning phone calls, more interested in significant others. They put their own needs before their kids. They don't report any concerns until there's a crisis point. Maybe they're not buying into what we're doing. They expect me to be doing something different in what my role is with that family. They might refuse services or not engage in services. And even when we give them the opportunity to provide input into the plans, they're not providing that input. So, based upon these behaviors, what we see and label these behaviors, if we're saying this is resistance or this is non-compliance or lazy, the parents aren't willing to do things differently. we don't care about their kids, or it's more self-centered. As we label the behaviors we see with that mindset, then it goes back to, what is the question we're really asking of our families? Um, are we asking them what has happened to them, or are we asking what is wrong with them? And so if we look at that trauma lens, just how we frame the behaviors that we see makes a big difference. And remembering to go back to the very basic of that change question, what has happened to you, and really getting that information from that parent. um, like we talked about with individuals, it takes that blame out of it, and that the we have to be aware that the symptoms that we've labeled as dysfunctional family behavior really are the consequences of accumulated and layered circumstances and stressors, and the reactive responses versus intentional acts. And just like individuals, when families and parents are overwhelmed by stressful events, it disrupts the development in all the domains: the physical, the behavioral, the immune, genetically, emotional, relationship, the brain development, cognitive. So just like in working with individuals, we have to be really focusing on understanding what that behavior is. And in order to do that, it's shifting that lens of how we're looking at that behavior. So again, as I was preparing for this training, had all these different ideas of where I was going to go. Um, there really isn't new information, um, but really kind of looking at myself and what are these challenges, and how am I looking at some of these behaviors? Where do I get stuck? And I know for coworkers, they're probably tired of me talking about it the past few weeks, but how many conversations we've been talking about cases. And I find myself, even with the knowledge on being on trauma and doing trainings and participating in so many trainings, I can fall back into that thinking about that behavior. And I have to catch myself. I'm like, oh, no, that's what I'm talking about. What do I really know about this behavior? What is this behavior really saying? Um, and that's an important thing as we shift how we think to how we intervene. Because if I see a behavior as non-compliance, then I may say, well, we need to file for a court review. But if it's a trauma response, then how is that going to impact a relationship? And again, I'm not really understanding that behavior, and it looks, I'm more blaming that parent or caregiver versus trying to understand that behavior better, and that I might need to do something different in that relationship. I also noticed the times that I would make those statements are times that maybe I was a little bit more rubbed up, or I was frustrated because I felt the need, again, to be helpful. And I see what this client, this child might need. And then I'm going to the parents who aren't at a place where they can do that. So it does have that internal struggle. And so out of my frustrations, instead of regulating myself, it's more that frustration on how I'm phrasing it with that parent and caregiver. And we have to be looking at our mindsets and how we're engaging parents, because they are so important in the work that we do with the kids and families. So then it goes back to the importance of shifting our thoughts on what these behaviors are, and looking at them as their adaptation for the parents and caregivers, just as they are for that child. And that when they're overwhelmed, these were the resources that were available that help them get through that challenging time. So when we're phrasing it as problem, it implies something is wrong, but phrasing it as adaptation, it recognizes that it was a resource and it assisted them in some way. So this is the first step, is understanding where our concepts are, what we're thinking about it. Um, and then the next step, which we're going to kind of go into in a little bit more detail, is to be trauma informed. We know that healing begins with a relationship. So how do we do that? And I think is a pretty challenging part. So SAMHSA developed, in the trauma informed care training, 6 guiding principles, and they were developed by national experts, including trauma survivors, and even looking at other participating in other trainings and looking at research. Everything kind of comes back to the foundation of working with anyone who's experienced trauma with these same guiding principles. Um, and I think it's an important thing when I was looking at, even for myself, and when things aren't going well, going back to these guiding principles and maybe how to make adjustments. One of the things that we don't want to do in working with parents and caregivers and children really is to re traumatize. So part of adapting these guiding principles is how are we helping in that healing process and not re-traumatizing. And again, that shift begins with how we think about the behavior and what we think about that person, because that's going to guide the direction that we go. So the first principle is that of safety, and there's physical and psychological aspects of that. And so physical, just making sure it's a safe environment. Are things lit? Just very basic things. Location. I think that's been a challenge for families. Some families don't feel safe meeting and talking about things in their home. So then you go into the office, and is that safe? I know in the past how many months because of COVID, we don't have a whole lot of options on that, which makes it challenging to engage our families. It is much harder for some of our families to engage virtually, whether it be through phone or even video. And that adds a lot of challenges as we talk about how to apply these principles. But it's also that safety of what we talk about in this office is okay. And how do we open up those conversations to better understand what that behavior is? Keith and Karen did a great training a few weeks ago. And one of the things that they talked about is just that importance of giving space. And that takes a lot of time to show that safety and giving that space. And sometimes in working with systems, it's hard because safety becomes a big issue. So sometimes when safety is an issue, how do you quickly kind of come in to help support the safety issues and then be able to have that time for safety? And how do you provide that safety in a quicker way just to support the safety of that child? So the next one of trustworthiness and transparency is another really important one that takes a lot of time. The transparency builds the trust. And I know from working with kids and families in different settings, it can be hard, but it can start from the first time you meet them. So the first time I meet a client or family, one of the first things I do is I explain what my role is. And so working through juvenile court, this is what my role is. I explain from the first time I talk with them, what are things I have to report to the court, what they're looking for why they're coming to see me. And I make it a point when I have to send letters to the courts that I write that with the clients I work with so that they know what I'm reporting to court. They're a part of that process and there's not going to be surprises. I'm not saying something that I'm not telling them right there. Even when I worked at Child Protective Services, I had some parents as clients, and there were oftentimes I had to write letters to court or even testify. And those were always things that I wanted to share with my clients, excuse me, before I went, just so they could be clear about what I had to say. And they helped guide that. Like I would ask them, like, what do you think about what we've been working on and how do you think that progress is? And I found that a lot of the parents were actually harder on themselves than I would say. And it was harder for them to kind of find those positive things. So it could be really helpful in talking about and processing with them. But the importance of when you say you're going to do something and doing it and providing that safe place so that no matter what happens in that case, you're able to process it and talk about in that setting. I know from cases I've worked in the past, it doesn't always go the way we want. And we do everything we can to minimize kids having to be taken out of the home. But there are times, because of safety reasons, that does have to happen. And the more safety that has been in that relationship and that trustworthiness, the more we're able to talk about it and encourage the parents and kids to have as much say in that process. So no matter what we think this case of direction is going to go in or what's happening, this is that foundation because lots of things happen. But the stronger that safety and that trustworthiness and how much upfront you are with what you're doing and how you're working together, the more likely when those tough conversations happen, you're able to talk about it and work through it. The next one of peer support. It's a flexible approach to building mutual healing relationships among equals. And I think we do have opportunities in our community to do that. I think parenting groups are a great resource for parents. They're with other parents who may be having challenges with the kids at the same age. We have a lot of variety on that. And the substance abuse programs, there's mentors available for them. There's peer mentors that are available for parenting, other agencies. I know one of the things for juvenile court we've worked on is mentors for kids, big brothers, big sisters, all areas for that peer support. Because at some point, we know that with agencies, we often are going to close these cases and they're going to move on. So we can talk about those internal resources, which is what we were talking about with the mindfulness and the breathing, but looking at the external resources, how are they linked in that community? What are the supports that are outside of them as well? And it's important to link that. With peer support, it's also important to think about ourselves as providers and how, with coworkers and other people, how we get that support. And I've mentioned my coworkers have been really great and patient with me the past few weeks as I keep referencing the training and talking about that. But it's been helpful as they've been very understanding as they talk about cases and accepting that feedback about, okay, we need to kind of regroup and make sure that we're all looking through this through that trauma lens. And I appreciate that support from them as we work through this together. I know that's how we keep working to apply these concepts on an everyday. The next part of collaboration and mutuality is really working with families and partnerships. And this can be challenging depending on the settings, but the more we work together and leveling the power differences, and we go in again as a partnership, the easier it is for the parents to build their voice, to feel that empowerment and understand their strengths better. I know that with Child Protective Services has worked with integrated services and they've developed a family decision model, which does exactly this, and it helps put families in that decision making position. One of the new things that we've been working on at juvenile court is probation transformation, and we have several work groups. One of the work groups that I'm part of is family engagement, and that's one of the areas that we're looking at is how do we partner more with parents and caregivers, and starting with understanding from the parent caregiver perspective, what are areas that we could improve on? How do we work on that collaborative relationship? Um, and getting more input from parents because they do have good resources to be able to make the decisions. And it may just be support and how we shift how our encouragement of that support in our setting to help empower them to be able to make decisions that we don't always have the right answers. So I think that's something that we're always working on. I think when you understand the strengths of families and you recognize those strengths, it's much easier to work together and help support them on utilizing those strengths in a more conscious way. So again, doing the first four kind of builds on the next, which is empowerment and voice and choice. So the more there's that partnership, there's the more of that safe place, then you're going to see more empowerment. When someone feels empowered, they're more likely to express what they want. They're able to make choices that are healthy and support the progress for themselves as well as for their kids. So it really strengthens the family and child by having choices. Um, Again, it recognizes the parents as adaptations as strengths and support them to see the strengths. And then they're willing to try more things. So the last area of cultural, historical, and gender issues, I think that the trauma lens really does a great job incorporating all of these issues because we're really looking at that individualized family experience. And so it's something when we talk about trying to understand um, what has happened to the kids, the parents, and the caregivers is really allowing them to explain their own experiences. So we have to start by being aware of any biases or own biases and stereotypes, not making assumptions, but allowing each person and parent and caregiver to tell us what their experience has been. Even if they identify with a certain ethnic group, what was that experience like for them? Something else we're doing with probation transformation is we have a group that actually started off as race and ethnicity group, but we changed it to equity group just to be inclusive of all different groups and making sure that all of the things that we're working on within the probation and court system is equal to all groups. And I came across a quote from a training um, from Implicit Bias and Structural Racism by Bobby Beale at Case Western. And I feel like it really just kind of summarizes not just that guiding principle, but in general with our families is that when we feel a sense of belonging, it's not because we're the same as everyone else, but because we've been accepted as we are. And it's really setting that environment of acceptance, which again begins where we start shifting our changes. So there's things that we can do even just on that day-to-day basis, just being kind and compassionate. We've talked about the importance of kind of being aware of our own internal cues and being relaxed regardless of what is happening. How do we stay in our zone of regulations? providing support for small and large stressors, create that structure that's predictable, and being upfront what that structure might look like. I also think it's important to be patient and kind to yourself, because it's not always easy to remain calm and supportive, especially when other people are struggling with that, just to remain in the zone of resiliency. But I do believe that the fundamental belief is that everybody has a possibility of living a satisfying and meaningful life, regardless of what has happened to them or what diagnosis and they've been given, and that we can support families to improve their health and wellness, so that they can live that self-directed life and strive to reach their full potential. So I wanted to make sure we had time for any questions or comments. Um, I know that was like a lot of information. It's a lot of conceptualization. So I'd like to hear from other people what thoughts they have or any questions.
This is a vibrant group, isn't it? We're processing, Jennifer. We're processing.
I felt like I ran through that so quickly.
No, it was great. It was great.
Is it okay if the participants unmute themselves to ask questions? Is that okay?
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'm going to guess we don't have any questions. We'll give another few seconds here.
I guess I have a question that I would like to ask if anyone would like to answer. Just based on the discussion today, is there anything that you feel like you would do differently as a provider?
I'm an inpatient therapist, so all of this information is really helpful for me because I know I have kiddos that want to tell me their traumas because they're going to start working through it. So this is super helpful because I kind of like am afraid of trauma because I deal with the putting out the flames all day, that really getting to the core I don't get to experience. So it's nice to learn about this.
Hi, Amanda Enderly here. I feel like, after going through this training and listening to a lot of this stuff, I definitely rethink my approach, and will definitely be doing that moving forward because I do kind of ramp myself up. I get frustrated when, things aren't going well. And then, I work with Jennifer, so she kind of reminded me is they're dealing with a lot's going on in their lives. And sometimes we just have to like get down to square one and, look at what they're going through and how we can help rather than getting frustrated and then, trying to bulldoze them into doing stuff because clearly that doesn't work.
And I think that's a good point too, Amanda, because sometimes we feel that pressure as helpers. We're all in this field because we want to help people and support them. And so when things don't go how maybe we think it should, or that it's not progressing as we want it, then it becomes more about our stuff. And then we do have that tendency to kind of jump in and want to fix that or do what we think is best instead of allowing the parent caregiver to kind of identify that and own that a little bit and see what has worked for them. But I think we do that for good reasons. I think our intent is to be helpful and support that kids and families.
Jennifer, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Shirley Good asks, are you finding children are handling the COVID situation better than adults? That's a great question.
Ooh, that is a great question. So I think it really depends. I think it's kind of individualized. I think some kids don't necessarily get as worried about it. Where parents, it kind of affects a lot of different things because it has such a ripple effect. But I'd like to hear from other people what they've seen, because I don't know that I can say a strong way or the other. I guess I see more stress from parents specifically about it. So I don't know if anybody else has any other thoughts on what they've seen.
I think in my experience, I've seen it from both sides. I don't think I could pinpoint on which is handling it better or worse. I think it's different for many of the cases that I work with.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty accurate.
Hi, Jennifer. This is Kim. I was going to add that I think what COVID has done and what really understanding brain development and our window of resiliency has done is provide a deeper understanding of just our interactions with all, whether that be with our clients, whether it be with our coworkers, whether it be with our family, understanding what our own window is, and when we're experiencing stressors outside of that and recognizing it, and then having that response to someone else that could be out of their window. And COVID has basically put stress on everyone. So it's like we're all juggling our window because of COVID. So that's why it's impacting, I think, everybody. And it just depends on how big your window is and how you're feeling that day of how that's going to impact you.
I think it's a very good point. And I think it too, it depends on what day for what person. Because I see that with just day-to-day interactions. I feel that within myself. Like some days I'm functioning better than others, and when those stressors are coming. And I think we all have that same stressor. The people that were supports to us are under the same stress. So when we look at our external resources that are just as stressed as we are, so it makes it harder for everybody. But yeah, being aware of yourselves and when you need to take care of yourselves, I think that's important is an important thing as providers on how we are taking care of ourselves.
Jennifer, Pamela Whiteley says, I think it's always nice to get the reminder of recognizing and celebrating strengths. This isn't something people hear very often.
I don't think we could talk about it enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think it is definitely something that's important to think about. And I think for our kids and families, it's really hard for them to identify that within themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So we play an important role in helping point that out to them so that they recognize that.
Also, in relation to the COVID question, Pamela says, I think it might depend on the kid's ability to express their emotions, which I, as a parent with a child that has some anxiety issues, would agree with that completely.
And I think kids too don't always understand, but they know, we know if we're as parents are stressed, then our kids feel that stress, even if they can't put the label and say it's because of COVID or they're worried about COVID. Just the fact that everywhere they go, even kids going to school, like teachers are stressed. There's a lot of responsibility, a lot going on in the classroom. Some of their outlets, whether it be the social, or sports or some of those other social things, they don't have that same access. So everybody is affected.
Mm-hmm. Shirley Good says, resiliency, yes. Thank you. I like the window and how big it is. She meant the resiliency, the chart that you were explaining to us.
Yes. It's a great visual. There's so much information just in that visual.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any other questions or anything they want to chat about? Feel free to unmute yourself. I know one thing I was going to mention, Jennifer, you talked about the group that was put together to talk about cultural differences. And I've noticed being in the community that we live in, which is wonderful, there isn't a lot of understanding maybe and exposure to cultures that are different from what we are used to or what we would consider traditional. And so I think just being able to have an open mind and open heart to understanding other cultures and ways of living and lifestyles. And then actually, just real quick, I'll put a plug in for on December 1st, we will have a session with Kate Petrowski. And Kate will be presenting on understanding and affirming the LGBTQIA+ community, tools for clinicians and community members. Again, that's Tuesday, December 1st from 3 to 4. So we would love to have anyone that would be interested in learning a little bit more about what Kate has to teach us. So
I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think that's going to be an
yeah,
excellent training, and
I
not
think so
always
too.
something that's accessible within our community. So
Right.
you guys have done a great job of bringing up a nice variety of topics that are important.
Awesome. Well, with that, Jennifer, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much everyone for being here. If you haven't already, please put your first and last name in the chat box so that you can receive credit for today's training. I also put the PowerPoint presentation in the chat box, and please do not forget to complete the survey after the session is over so that you can get your CEU and certificate of attendance. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon. We'll see you next time.